You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Without further ado, we're joined by Eric Trager. This is the first time that Eric will be joining us on the show. Eric Trager is the Esther K. Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute. He's an expert on Egyptian politics, an expert on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And Eric, we want to welcome you to the Final Say.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure, absolutely. And we hope, I have a feeling this may be the first of many. You were in Egypt during the 2011 revolts against Mubarak and have returned often, from what I understand. So we appreciate you joining us today to share your firsthand insights and your analysis regarding Israel's southern neighbor. And as you just heard, prior to me welcoming you onto the show, you know, this small battle, if you will, between Hamas and Israel, which has been flaming for many years, is rapidly boiling up to having ramifications that are now affecting people all over the globe. So I wanted to open the show by asking if you can please give our listeners a very brief background on the tectonic shifts of Egyptian leadership since Mubarak was overthrown following Obama's Arab Spring, as I would refer to it, his catalyzing 2009 speech in Cairo that helped usher in that transition, and that I think will set us up for some hearty questions.
Well, again, thanks for having me. I have to strongly disagree with you, by the way, with your last statement. I certainly don't think that the president's 2009 address in Cairo had anything to do with the Arab Spring, and I think it's very important to remember that many of the changes that we witness in these countries, as frankly in most countries, are often due to domestic politics that almost stand apart entirely, with very rare exceptions, from global politics. So, the 2011 uprising was really produced first and foremost by the fact that the Mubarak regime, after 30 years in power, had lost its way. The economy was doing well on paper, but there was very little trickle down. There was very high youth unemployment. There was rampant corruption. And there was the prospect that Mubarak would be handing over power to his son, Gamal, which many Egyptians regarded as a return to the days of the pharaohs and the kings that they had left behind over 60 years before. So when people rose up on January 25th, and as you mentioned, I was there for that, they were unified against the regime, but not really unified for very much. And when the regime fell, that provided an opening for the best organized group, the Muslim Brotherhood, to take the momentum, to win elections, and of course to win the presidential elections in 2012. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a large organization. It has about 500,000 members, probably about 5 million supporters. I think that's generally a fair estimate in a country of 86 million people. But it was really the only political force that could leverage a get out the vote effort that was sufficiently organized around the country to mobilize people. And of course, it had a very different foreign policy outlook than the Mubarak regime. The Muslim Brotherhood's whole philosophy is based on rejecting the West. And one of the key elements of that is rejecting the creation of the State of Israel. I mean, Muslim brothers still brag about the fact that their militants stayed in the 1948 war, continued fighting against the nascent State of Israel at the moment that the Egyptian army had already accepted the ceasefire. So, the Muslim Brotherhood had a very different view, and also it had a very close relationship with Hamas, which is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, what that meant was that in 2012, November 2012, when there was the last round of Hamas-Israel fighting in Gaza, the Muslim Brotherhood government, headed by President Mohammed Morsi, was able to use his relationship with Hamas to try to get Hamas to accept the terms of a ceasefire. The thing that many people forget, however, is that until that happened, until Morsi succeeded in getting Hamas to accept the ceasefire, there was a great deal of uncertainty as to what Egypt would actually do. Everyone wondered whether Egypt would use that moment to pivot away from its treaty with Israel, away from its alignment with the United States, and towards something very different. Not to say that it would completely break the treaty, but that would be the start of sort of a long pivot away from the West, because that is certainly what the Brotherhood suggested it would do based on its ideological commitments. That did not happen, of course, and there was a ceasefire. But fast forward almost 2 years to the current fighting, what you have is a new government that came to power after the coup of last July. It's headed by an ex-general. He is close with the Israelis. He cooperates very actively with Israel on security in the Sinai in particular, and has met frequently, especially when he was defense minister, with Israeli officials, and certainly views the relationship with Israel as a stabilizing force in the region, and views Hamas as a threat because he emerged to power by combating the Brotherhood and naturally associates Hamas, again, the Palestinian Brotherhood, as being part of what it is he's fighting in Egypt. So, 50 weeks out of the year, we could say he's a very anti-Hamas Egyptian president. The problem, though, is that when you have a crisis like the one we have in Gaza now, he's less capable to get a ceasefire sooner because he's less able to influence Hamas. But I also want to disagree with something else you opened with, and I've been trying to make this point quite a bit. I don't think that this Gaza fighting has very far-reaching implications. Make no mistake, this is a horrible situation. There have been hundreds of civilians killed, soldiers dying. Israelis have been hiding out for weeks now in their stairwells and in shelters from rockets. So this is a horrible situation. But what makes this current conflict different from 2012 is that there is no uncertainty about whether Egypt will shift. There's no fear that this might become a broader regional crisis. This is really a local crisis centered on Gaza. It's not affecting any major regional players. And so, frankly, when we look around the map of the region, I could see many other issues that should be getting much more attention. The situation in Syria, the Iran negotiations, which have been extended, the emergence of a terrorist state in the heart of Iraq. I mean, all of these things are much more pressing than the current Gaza fighting because there's just no risk that this will spread anywhere else.
Well, so two quick things before I move on to the next question. So one is I was actually very careful with my use of the word catalyzing, because I do agree, and we have followed on this show even the situation on the ground in Egypt, from the people starving, jobless, looking, just trying to get their next loaf of bread. But I do believe that helped give it helped pave the way. It helped give air cover, if you will. But I wanted to move on. In the aftermath of Morsi's fall at the hands of what at the time was Field Marshal, now President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, there appears to be an evolving alignment of interest between Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. I guess you could throw Jordan into the mix, but given the power broker capability of both Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I wanted to get your sense, because both of these countries right now are at odds on many fronts, including the others you just mentioned, with our own State Department. What do you make of these shifts, and what kind of manifestations do you expect those to have from an Israeli and U.S. and maybe broader Middle East perspective? In short, a behind-the-scenes alignment of Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabian interests. It's kind of an unusual event given the last 40 to 60 years.
Well, I mean, you're certainly correct in noticing a shift in America's, alliances or let's say a slight shift away from its traditional allies. The pursuit of a nuclear deal with Iran has been the foremost priority of this administration. But in the process of getting that kind of deal with Iran, if it even gets it, it has turned a blind eye to many of Iran's other abuses around the region, including its fomenting of sectarian tensions, things that it's been doing throughout the Arab Spring, its interventions, of course, in Syria and previously in Lebanon, its prior support and frankly ongoing support of Hamas. And in the process, it's the United States is very much, let's say, scared our traditional allies that we might be pivoting away from them. And I agree with you that that's a very significant problem. Now, Egypt is one area in which we could actually rally our traditional Sunni allies, because Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait have very strongly supported the regime of Sisi, and we could kind of get back on the right page with them by moving forward with this new regime in Egypt, by continuing to send military aid. At least we could signal to them that we're not completely pivoting away from our prior commitments, and yet the administration has not done that. It hasn't done that, by the way, because Senator Leahy of Vermont has continued to hold up military shipments to Egypt, but nonetheless, Egypt has not gotten shipments from the United States in nearly a year. That's having a toll on our relationship with Egypt. It's also affecting the way the other allies, the other Sunni Arab allies of the United States are viewing us.
Now, of course, even for all those years under Mubarak, at least we had a predictable ally serving the interests of the U.S. and as somewhat of a reliable hedge against radical Islamists on the southern border of Israel, not just in the Sinai, but of course from Israel's perspective, that was the demilitarization of the Sinai was critical to maintain peace. Now, al-Sisi has pretty much restored the partnership with Israel that was at risk and fracturing under Morsi. But it seems like to a large extent he's done this on his own and in conflict again, often with the State Department. How do you envision al-Sisi welcome John Kerry to Egypt? Do you think that was kind of an open arms welcoming, or I was so good to see you because you said so on TV?
Well, we saw today that there was certainly not an open arm. First of all, Kerry's team had to go through metal detectors when they arrived at the presidential palace. So that right there is sort of a slap in the face. Now, it's not clear whether it's just a slap in the face that Egypt initiated, whether this is some sort of response to perhaps a similar thing that happened to Egyptian officials when they were here. We don't really know what was behind that, but there's no question that relations between Egypt and the United States right now are quite cool. Relations between Egypt and Israel are better than they've ever been, and both Israelis and Egyptians will tell you that, certainly when it comes to security cooperation. And frankly, it's given rise to a new joke, which is that it used to be Kissinger doing shuttle diplomacy between Israel and Egypt. Now it's Israel doing shuttle diplomacy between Egypt and the United States.
That's it's an interesting perspective. In fact, I believe, and I want to get your opinion on this, whether Israel actually had al-Sisi's full support and probably an alignment of strategic goals and even tactical implementations of border strategy, et cetera, before he ever launched Operation Protective Edge, not the air power part, but the land incursion itself.
I mean, I really don't know the extent of the coordination prior to the operation or prior to the ground invasion. It wouldn't be surprising if the two sides had briefed each other on it. What we do know, though, is that Sisi and Netanyahu spoke before Egypt released its ceasefire initiative, and that as soon as it was released, Israel therefore accepted it while Hamas rejected it. Note that ceasefire initiative would effectively award Hamas nothing for starting the fighting, and would basically leave Hamas just forced to stop its rocket fire and wait for further negotiations on Rafah and other issues later. But Egypt has held firm on that. Egypt is very committed, like Israel, to ensuring that Hamas does not come out of this with anything to point to as a victory. And it's frankly not clear that the United States is quite on the same page, which of course is not to say that the United States is looking to give Hamas a victory, but the United States seems to be more eager to see this fighting wrap up sooner, even if that means getting Egypt to concede just enough to make that happen.
Eric, I agree, and I tend to tie that to the comment you were making more before about the status quo of the Egyptian people that led to the desire for a change in governance in the first place, and that is, I believe, whether we're cozying up to a dictator or we're simply satisfied with putting a temporary ceasefire in place with radical Islamists, I think it's too easy for us to see peace as the equivalent of temporary quiet, and I have a problem with that. So the question I have for you is, can lasting peace even be achieved through anything short of a complete removal of Hamas's leadership and terrorist infrastructure, especially in light of their 100% steadfast dedication to the absolute and total destruction of Israel and all Jewish inhabitants in the British Mandate area?
Well, I mean, you're suggesting something that Israel itself isn't even pursuing. I mean, Israel's not pursuing the destruction of Hamas's leadership, and it's not doing that because it's concerned that if Hamas's government falls in Gaza, that there will either be chaos or a much worse party emerging, such as the jihadis or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So, you know, I mean, sitting here 6,000 miles away, I don't know that we're in the best position to try to kind of figure out the domestic political equation that would yield a better outcome in the region. But what I do know is that whatever the administration is trying to achieve right now, both Egypt and Israel appear committed to ensuring that Hamas emerges from this much, much weaker. Israel is likely to ask for at least about another week, maybe longer, to continue wrapping up tunnels. And that is the consequence of a fight that has escalated to this point. Now, will it actually work? Will Hamas actually emerge weakened? That's all in the eye of the beholder. It's very hard to imagine it emerging stronger militarily, but at the same time, if it has in fact captured an Israeli soldier, a living Israeli soldier, and we frankly don't know one way or the other right now, that will be a very difficult thing for Israel strategically.
Now, this leads to the obvious question, does Egypt see Fatah, with or without Abbas at the helm, as a viable partner for peace? Because if you look at the vacuum scenarios you suggest, which is the fear of ISIS or even more radicals coming in and taking control of that area, the only immediate and obvious alternative would be for Fatah to come in. But you know, the challenge is Fatah has shown itself often to be something akin to Hamas Light, with a better PR campaign and a fairly efficient money laundering model. From Egypt's perspective, do you think they would feel very comfortable with weakening Hamas to the point where they could support a Fatah recapture of the leadership role in Gaza?
Well, I mean, look, I don't agree, by the way, with your characterization of Fatah, but nonetheless, certainly Egypt wants to see Fatah strengthen and wants to see Fatah back in government in Gaza, and, you know, preferably for Egypt, in control of the Gaza side, or I should say the Palestinian side of the Rafah Gaza border. Now, I mean, we saw that in Sisi's communications with Mahmoud Abbas, but it's not clear to me how viable that is. The Palestinian Authority is extremely weak in Gaza. Fatah is a very weak entity, and as you alluded to earlier, kind of trying to get that might be an investment in yet another weak and not very democratic leader in Abbas. So, frankly, I don't see what the security arrangement will be once this fighting ends. I do think that Egypt is going to do everything it can to keep Rafah closed because it really wants Israel to be the one responsible for the entry and exit into Gaza. And I think that's going to be a point of contention between Israel and Egypt moving forward. It's not going to be a point of contention that creates hostilities, of course, but it's going to be, let's say, a gentleman's competition over Gaza. But just to kind of wrap up here, I think what we're seeing is a very local conflict that has, yes, occupied the headlines because of how terrible it is in many, many ways, but which actually has very little impact on the broader region, especially at a time where there's a terrorist state that's being founded in the heart of Iraq, when there are negotiations that have been extended with Iran, and in which, frankly, a whole host of states are not only broken down, but overrun by competing jihadi groups. So, I mean, I just see this Gaza conflict as something that's distracted our policymakers from much, much more threatening issues to the United States.
Final question I have for you is the Russians, of course, are distracted with their hegemonic interests in Ukraine, but they've also shown similar interests in Egypt, and Egypt has cooperated with them as a bit of a hedge against the U.S. Where do you see them fitting in this equation, if at all? Because they've been, from best I could tell, fairly quiet.
They have been quiet, but of course they offered to sell Egypt $3 billion worth of weapons a few months ago before Sisi became president, and it does look like Egypt might tilt towards Russia or certainly those kinds of deals if it doesn't get weapons from the United States anytime soon. It's not something, by the way, that Egypt prefers because it gets its weapons from the United States for free, or at least it gets $1.3 billion of its weapons for free, whereas Russia would make Egypt pay. But of course, Egypt wouldn't pay, and this is sort of the funny story of the region. That those weapons would be purchased by the UAE and Saudi Arabia from Russia for Egypt, so that Saudi Arabia and the UAE could signal their displeasure with the United States. So Russia gets wrapped in this knot of America's fraying relations with our traditional allies, and that is really something that the administration has to redouble its efforts on getting right. It is a huge mistake with so much uncertainty to abandon our traditional allies over a number of, certainly justified, but nonetheless relatively small domestic political disagreements.
Well, it shows that leadership is particularly a challenge. And I raise that question because none of these things really do occur in a vacuum. And when you try to imagine a conversation between LCC and Kerry in the back room, and I have to imagine all of these things come on the table because you don't get too many sit-downs to do this kind of arm wrestling. So every side is, of course, going to try to use it to their best advantage. Eric, if you would, please give our audience your website where they can reach you for further information about the organization.
You can follow me. Sure. You could follow me on Twitter at Eric Trager 18. And our website is washingtoninstitute.org.
Okay, Eric, thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate the insight, and I appreciate you being very candid and willing to take me on in places we may disagree.
Anytime.
Thanks so much. Be well.
Bye-bye.